Imagine becoming the most wanted man on Earth. And instead of running, you choose to hide, not on a remote island, not inside a mountain fortress, not aboard a secret submarine, but inside a cramped concrete bunker buried beneath the ruins of your own capital. It's April 1945. Berlin is dying. Every hour, the city shakes under another wave of Soviet artillery. Entire streets vanish beneath explosions. Buildings that survived years of war collapse in seconds. Smoke rises so high that daylight struggles to break through. Surrounding the city are more than 2 million Soviet soldiers. They aren't slowly advancing. They're closing a trap. And at its center sits Adolf Hitler, a man who only a few years earlier controlled most of Europe. Now refuses to leave a bunker measuring barely 50 meters from end to end. But here's the part that sounds almost impossible. For decades after the war, almost nobody could point to where that bunker actually was. You would think the location of one of history's most infamous places would be obvious. It wasn't. Berlin had been bombed into rubble, then rebuilt, then divided by the Berlin Wall, then reunited, then rebuilt again. Entire streets disappeared. New buildings covered old foundations. Neighborhoods changed beyond recognition. Eventually, the place where the Third Reich took its final breath became so ordinary that thousands of people unknowingly walked across it every day. Some parked their cars there. Others stopped nearby to buy lunch. Few realized they were standing above one of the 20th century's most significant historical sites. Tonight, we're going underground. Not to chase myths about secret escapes. Not to search for hidden Nazi treasure. But to reconstruct, almost minute by minute, what really happened inside Hitler's bunker. What Soviet soldiers actually found when they captured it. And why the truth remained hidden for so many years. To understand that story, we have to begin with one ordinary man. Not a famous general. Not a politician. Not even someone who made important decisions. A telephone operator. His name was Rokas Mish. Rokas Mish wasn't supposed to witness history. If anything, he spent most of his military career trying not to stand out. He wasn't famous. He wasn't particularly ambitious. He simply had an unusual talent for surviving. Years earlier, during the invasion of Poland, he had been badly wounded. Many of the men beside him never came home. He did. His injuries ended his frontline service. At the time, it probably felt like terrible luck. Looking back, it may have saved his life. Instead of returning to combat, Mish was reassigned. Eventually, he found himself serving inside Hitler's personal bodyguard unit. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't heroic. It was mostly routine. Guard duty, telephone work, delivering messages, keeping his head down. As Mish would later admit, one of the reasons he survived the Third Reich was surprisingly simple. He asked very few questions. In a dictatorship where curiosity could be dangerous, that was often the safest decision. Then, in January 1945, his assignment changed once again. He received orders to report beneath the Reich Chancellery. He walked down a long flight of concrete stairs, passed through thick steel blast doors, and entered a place he would later describe as a coffin of concrete. He had no way of knowing it then, but he had just entered the final headquarters of Nazi Germany. And over the next few months, he would witness the collapse of an empire from only a few steps away. The bunker would become his world, a world without sunlight, without fresh air, without any real hope of escape. And before long, it would become the final destination for the most powerful men in the Third Reich. The first thing you notice isn't the silence. It's the air. Heavy, damp, almost impossible to describe. It smells of wet concrete, diesel fuel, machine oil, and something stale that seems to have seeped into every wall. Every breath reminds you that you're underground. Far underground. Above your head, Berlin is being torn apart. Down here, it almost feels as though the outside world has stopped existing. As Rokas Mish descended the final staircase beneath the Reich Chancellery, the temperature seemed to change with every step. The cold wasn't sharp. It was the kind that quietly wrapped itself around your clothes and refused to leave. The deeper he went, the heavier the atmosphere became. Then came the first steel blast door. It swung open slowly. Behind it, another corridor, another blast door, more concrete. Only after passing through several layers of reinforced defenses did he finally enter what would become the center of the collapsing Third Reich. It wasn't impressive. That surprised almost everyone who saw it. After years of Nazi propaganda portraying unlimited power, people imagined Hitler commanding the war from some vast underground fortress. The reality was almost disappointing. The bunker was cramped, narrow, barely 50 meters from one end to the other. You could walk its entire length in less than a minute. The corridor felt less like military headquarters and more like the hallway of an aging apartment building. Only this hallway had no windows, no natural light, no fresh air. Tiny rooms lined both sides. Bedrooms, storage closets, a communications room, a conference room, bathrooms. Most measured little more than 10 square meters. Small enough that stretching your arms could almost touch both walls. The ceilings felt unusually low, whether they actually were, or whether the weight of thousands of tons of concrete above created that illusion. Nobody could quite say, but nearly everyone who entered described the same feeling. The bunker seemed to press down on you. Not physically, psychologically, as if the building itself wanted to remind you. There was nowhere else to go. Then there were the walls. The lower bunker had only been completed the previous year. Construction crews had rushed every stage. Germany no longer had the luxury of taking its time. The result was obvious. Moisture collected everywhere. Tiny beads of water clung to the concrete. Dark stains spread across corners. The floors never seemed completely dry. Even during warmer days, everything felt slightly damp, like living inside a cave that had forgotten what sunlight looked like. No amount of heating ever truly fixed it. The bunker remained cold, not because the temperature was especially low, but because the moisture never left. And then, there was the lighting. Harsh white bulbs hung naked from the ceiling. No lampshades, no warm colors, just rows of exposed lights burning day and night. Morning looked exactly like midnight. Midnight looked exactly like noon. Without windows, your body slowly stopped understanding time. People forgot when they had gone to sleep, forgot when they had eaten, forgot whether they had been underground for 3 days or 10. Time dissolved into routine. But if the lighting unsettled newcomers, the sound finished the job. At first, it barely registered. A low vibration somewhere beneath your feet. Then, you realized it wasn't beneath the floor. It was everywhere. The generators, always running. The ventilation system, never stopping. Water pumps worked around the clock to prevent groundwater from flooding the bunker. Every machine produced its own steady hum. Together, they became a single, endless noise. After a few days, most people stopped noticing it, until the rare moment when one generator briefly shut down. The silence felt almost frightening, like the bunker itself had stopped breathing. Within seconds, the engine started again. The familiar hum returned. Oddly enough, people relaxed. Sometimes, even unpleasant sounds become comforting if you've lived with them long enough. Mish's workplace wasn't glamorous. He wasn't seated beside Hitler. He wasn't attending strategic conferences. His job was hidden behind a modest doorway leading into the communications room. A switchboard, rows of telephones, endless cables disappearing into the walls. Every call passed through him. Army headquarters, government ministries, field commanders, medical staff, messengers. From sunrise until long after midnight, the telephones never seemed to stop ringing. Each conversation carried another fragment of the war, another request, another report, another emergency. At first, Mish listened. He couldn't help himself, but he quickly learned something. Knowing too much inside the Third Reich could be dangerous. The safest employees were often those who heard everything, yet remembered nothing. So he developed a habit. He focused only on the connection. Static. Interference. Whether the line remained clear. The words themselves, he forced himself to ignore. It became a survival strategy. Above ground, the situation was deteriorating faster than almost anyone inside the bunker admitted. Soviet artillery now struck central Berlin almost continuously. Entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath bombardment. The streets became impossible to recognize. Streetcars lay overturned. Apartment buildings burned uncontrollably. Water mains burst beneath explosions, flooding intersections with freezing water before shells shattered them again. Smoke covered the city like permanent weather. Meanwhile, more than 2 million Soviet troops continued pushing forward. Every hour, they came closer. Every hour, another defensive position disappeared. The men defending Berlin fought with determination. But determination couldn't replace ammunition, or fuel, or experienced soldiers. Many German defenders were boys barely old enough to shave. Others were elderly men who should never have been handed rifles in the first place. Police officers, civil servants, members of the Volkssturm. Some had fired only a handful of practice rounds before being ordered into combat. Yet they were expected to stop one of the largest armies ever assembled. History had already decided the outcome. The people inside Berlin simply hadn't accepted it yet. Inside the bunker, daily life continued with surprising normality. Secretaries typed reports. Officers hurried through corridors carrying stacks of paperwork. Cooks prepared meals. Someone complained about the plumbing. Someone else argued over room assignments. It sounds unbelievable, but that's often how history unfolds. Even while the world is collapsing, someone is still worrying about whether dinner will be late. Human beings cling to routine. Sometimes, it's the only thing preventing panic. And nowhere was that more obvious than inside Hitler's bunker. Because every morning, despite the explosions overhead, the military conferences continued exactly as scheduled, as though Germany still had a realistic chance of winning a war that had already been lost. Every morning, without fail, the same ritual began. No matter how many districts had fallen overnight, no matter how many buildings had disappeared beneath Soviet artillery, no matter how hopeless the military situation had become, Hitler held his military conference. Routine had become the last illusion of control. Around dawn, the bunker slowly came to life. There was no sunrise to mark the beginning of the day, no light filtering through curtains, no birds outside the window, only the steady buzz of generators, and the sound of boots echoing through the corridor. Secretaries were usually the first awake. They prepared maps, organized reports, sharpened pencils, placed fresh stacks of documents onto the conference table. Every morning looked exactly like the one before, almost as if the war outside had paused. It hadn't. Officers began arriving one by one. Most hadn't slept much. Some hadn't slept at all. The strain showed on every face. Dark circles beneath their eyes. Unshaven faces. Uniforms that looked as exhausted as the men wearing them. These weren't the confident officers who had once marched triumphantly through Paris. Months, even years, of retreat had changed them. Now they carried only bad news, and every one of them knew it. The conference room itself was surprisingly ordinary. No towering ceilings. No enormous command center filled with flashing lights. Just a modest room dominated by a large wooden table. Maps covered nearly every available wall. Colored pins marked army positions. Thin strings connected supply routes. Greased pencils traced defensive lines that changed almost every hour. Anyone looking closely would notice something strange. The red pins, representing Soviet forces, seemed to multiply every day. The German markers kept disappearing. Then, Hitler entered. The room immediately fell silent. Not because anyone expected good news, because habit demanded it. Everyone stood. Nobody spoke. For years, this simple entrance had commanded absolute authority. Now, it felt different. The man walking into the room barely resembled the confident dictator seen in old newsreels. He was 65 years old, but looked much older. His shoulders had slumped. His left hand often trembled uncontrollably. Witnesses later described his skin as pale, almost gray. His once powerful voice had become softer, sometimes difficult to hear. The physical decline was impossible to ignore. Yet the authority, at least inside these walls, still remained. Hitler walked slowly toward the map table. He rarely looked at anyone immediately. Instead, his eyes fixed on the front lines, or rather, on where he wished the front lines still were. An officer stepped forward. The morning briefing began. At first, the reports followed the usual military format. Enemy advances, German casualties, destroyed bridges, fuel shortages, lost communications. Each sentence painted another piece of the same picture. Germany was losing, rapidly. One general pointed toward the eastern edge of Berlin. Soviet armored units have reached. Before he finished, Hitler interrupted him. Impossible. The room froze. The general hesitated, then quietly repeated the information. It has been confirmed. Again, Hitler rejected it. Your information is incorrect. Nobody argued further. This scene repeated itself again and again throughout the final weeks of the war. Reality arrived inside the bunker through reports. Hitler answered it with belief. The gap between those two worlds grew larger every day. For years, Hitler had built his reputation on instinct. Again and again, he had ignored military advice. And sometimes, astonishingly, he had been right. During the invasion of France, many generals considered his strategy reckless. It worked. During earlier campaigns, bold decisions often produced remarkable victories. Success reinforced confidence. Confidence gradually became certainty, and certainty became dangerous. By 1945, Hitler trusted his own judgment more than the reports arriving from the battlefield, even when those reports came from officers standing only a few feet away. Maps became both his greatest comfort and his greatest deception. Looking down at colored lines on paper, everything still appeared manageable. Move one division here. Launch another counterattack there. Hold this bridge. Recapture that crossroads. On paper, the war still looked organized. Outside, entire divisions no longer existed. Some units listed on the maps had already been destroyed days earlier. Others had lost contact completely. Orders continued traveling toward formations that were no longer alive to receive them. The maps had begun telling a different story than reality. Yet every morning, the conference continued. Perhaps the most famous example came when Hitler placed his hopes on General Felix Steiner. Steiner commanded what remained of an army detachment north of Berlin. On paper, it looked capable of launching a powerful counterattack. In reality, it barely existed. Many of its tanks had been destroyed. Fuel was almost gone. Ammunition was desperately low. Thousands of soldiers listed on official reports were either dead, captured, or scattered across the countryside. The force simply wasn't capable of doing what Hitler demanded. But inside the bunker, that truth hadn't fully arrived yet. Orders were issued anyway. Steiner was instructed to attack, to drive south, to smash the Soviet advance, to save Berlin. The problem was that there was almost nothing left with which to attack. As the briefing continued, the atmosphere inside the room became increasingly uncomfortable. Every officer understood the situation. Every officer knew Germany could no longer win. But saying those words aloud, especially here, required extraordinary courage or extraordinary desperation. Most chose silence, not because they believed victory remained possible, because experience had taught them what happened to people who openly challenged Hitler. Years of absolute authority had created a room where everyone understood reality, yet very few dared describe it completely. Outside, the artillery never stopped. Even several meters beneath reinforced concrete, the explosions could still be felt. The lights occasionally flickered. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Coffee cups trembled gently across the conference table. Nobody reacted anymore. The bombardment had become part of daily life. Like the generators, like the damp air, like the endless telephones. Human beings possess an extraordinary ability to adapt, even to constant danger. After nearly 2 hours, the meeting finally ended. Officers gathered their documents. Some immediately returned to telephone rooms. Others disappeared into offices to prepare yet another series of impossible orders. Hitler remained standing before the maps, still studying them, still searching for movements that no longer existed, still convinced, somewhere, someone would launch the counterattack that could change everything. It never came, and within only a few days, the illusion holding the bunker together would finally begin to collapse. Not because of another Soviet victory, but because one exhausted general finally found the courage to tell Hitler the truth. By April 22, 1945, the war had entered its final act. The explosions above the bunker sounded closer than ever. Not because people imagined them, because they were. Every hour, Soviet artillery moved another little closer to the Reich Chancellery. The map inside the conference room was becoming outdated faster than anyone could replace the pins. Berlin was no longer being defended around its edges. The battle had entered the city itself. That morning began like every other. Reports arrived. Officers assembled. Maps covered the table. Coffee sat untouched. Hitler entered without speaking. His face looked even more exhausted than usual. The deep lines beneath his eyes had become permanent. Witnesses later recalled that he seemed to move more slowly every day, almost as though the bunker itself was draining what little strength he had left. Still, he expected good news, or at least, something that resembled hope. General Alfred Jodl began the briefing. His voice remained calm, professional, almost emotionless. That wasn't because he felt calm. It was because every officer inside the room understood that emotion accomplished nothing anymore. One by one, the reports continued. The Ninth Army was trapped. Communications had broken down in several sectors. Entire neighborhoods of Berlin had already fallen. Soviet forces were advancing from multiple directions. Then came the report everyone had been waiting for. Steiner. Hitler looked up immediately. The room became perfectly silent. General Felix Steiner had been ordered to launch the counterattack that would supposedly split the Soviet advance in half. For days, Hitler had built his entire strategy around that single attack. If Steiner advanced, perhaps Berlin could still be relieved. Perhaps the war could somehow continue. Perhaps everything wasn't over. Jodl hesitated, just for a second. Then he quietly spoke. Steiner was unable to attack. The sentence hung in the room. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Hitler stared across the table. Unable. Jodl nodded. The necessary forces were not available. It was the polite military way of saying there was no army left. Steiner hadn't refused. He simply couldn't perform the impossible. Most of his formations existed only on paper. The tanks weren't there. The fuel wasn't there. The men weren't there. The offensive had never been possible. Everyone in the room already knew that. Everyone, except Hitler. For several long seconds, he said nothing. Witnesses later described the silence as almost unbearable. The bunker had always felt tense. Now, it felt frozen. Then, everything exploded. Not outside. Inside. Hitler slammed both hands onto the map table. The room erupted with shouting. Years of frustration, fear, and denial poured out all at once. He accused his generals of betrayal, cowardice, incompetence. He declared that everyone had lied to him, that the army had failed him, that the war was lost because nobody possessed the will to fight. The outburst continued for several minutes. No one interrupted. No one defended themselves. There was nothing left to say. This wasn't simply another angry speech. The officers present immediately understood something profound had changed. For the first time, Hitler openly admitted the possibility that Germany had lost the war. Not publicly, not to the nation, but inside the bunker, among his closest military advisors. The illusion that victory remained possible finally cracked. When the shouting stopped, the room remained silent. Hitler looked exhausted. Not relieved, not calmer, simply empty. Then he quietly said something few people ever expected to hear. The war is lost. Nobody answered, because everyone had known it for months. The difference was, now he knew it too. What happened next surprised almost everyone. Instead of discussing evacuation, Hitler announced he would remain in Berlin. He would not flee south. He would not attempt to escape the city. He would stay in the bunker until the end. Some officers stared at him in disbelief. Others had expected exactly that. For years, Hitler had spoken about dying in Germany rather than allowing himself to be captured. Now, those words no longer sounded like rhetoric. They sounded like a decision. One by one, the officers left the conference room. Nobody spoke much afterward. The atmosphere throughout the bunker changed almost immediately. Until that morning, many staff members had still quietly believed some miracle might occur. Perhaps a new army would arrive. Perhaps the Western Allies and the Soviets would begin fighting each other. Perhaps negotiations would somehow buy time. Those hopes, however unrealistic, had kept people moving. Now, they were disappearing. Raucous Mish noticed the difference almost instantly. The telephones never stopped ringing. But the conversations had changed. Fewer discussions about counterattacks. More discussions about evacuation, destroying documents, moving personnel, preparing for the inevitable. The call sounded different. Not louder, just heavier. Everyone on the other end of the line seemed to understand that history was closing in. Above ground, Berlin had become almost impossible to recognize. Entire districts burned without interruption. Smoke covered the skyline so completely that even during midday, the city seemed trapped beneath permanent twilight. The roads were filled with civilians dragging whatever belongings they could carry. Some searched desperately for relatives. Others searched for food. Many simply searched for somewhere safer. There was nowhere left. The battle had reached nearly every street. Soviet artillery no longer fired only at military targets. The entire city had become the battlefield. Inside the bunker, routine continued. Almost stubbornly, meals were still served. Secretaries still typed reports. Guards still changed shifts. It seems almost impossible to imagine, but human beings often cling hardest to ordinary routines when surrounded by extraordinary chaos. Making coffee, organizing paperwork, cleaning a corridor. Small acts of normality became quiet acts of resistance against panic. That evening, Hitler withdrew into his private quarters. He saw very few people. Those who did meet him noticed something unsettling. The anger was gone. The shouting had disappeared. In its place was an almost unnatural calm. Sometimes, acceptance is quieter than despair. For everyone else inside the bunker, that calm felt far more frightening than the outburst had, because it suggested something. A decision had already been made. They simply didn't know what it was yet. Within the next few days, they would. And with that decision, the final hours of the Third Reich would truly begin. By the final week of April, almost everyone who still had the chance to leave Berlin had already gone. Government ministries were evacuating. Military headquarters were relocating. Convoys streamed westward whenever a road remained open. The capital was no longer a place people escaped to. It was a place they escaped from. Yet, a handful of people were still voluntarily making their way toward the city. One of them was Eva Braun. For years, she had existed almost entirely in the background. The German public knew her face only vaguely. Many didn't even know she existed. Hitler had carefully protected his private life. He wanted Germans to believe he belonged entirely to the nation, not to a wife, not to a family, not to an ordinary domestic life. Eva accepted that role. She remained almost invisible. Photographs showed her smiling at mountain retreats, walking through gardens, laughing with friends, far removed from politics, far removed from war. At least, that was the image. Now, with Berlin collapsing around her, she received every opportunity to leave. Aircraft still managed to reach the capital occasionally. Cars attempted dangerous journeys through shrinking corridors. Several of Hitler's closest associates urged her to escape. She refused. Every time. Not because she believed Germany could still win. By this point, almost no one believed that. She refused because she had already made her decision. If Hitler stayed, she stayed. Whether history would judge that decision as loyalty, devotion, or something far more complicated, was no longer her concern. When she finally arrived at the bunker, the contrast was striking. Many witnesses later remembered the same thing. She smiled. Not constantly, but more often than anyone expected. She greeted staff politely, remembered names, thanked cooks for meals. Sometimes she even joked with the secretaries. To newcomers, it almost seemed impossible. How could someone remain cheerful while an empire collapsed overhead? Perhaps because accepting reality sometimes brings an unexpected calm. Raucous Mish saw her almost every day. Unlike many senior officials, she treated the bunker staff as ordinary people. She stopped beside the switchboard, asked how things were going, sometimes chatted for a few minutes before continuing down the corridor. There was nothing particularly remarkable about the conversations, and perhaps that was what made them remarkable. Only a few meters away, the greatest military disaster in German history was unfolding. Yet people still exchanged polite greetings, still discussed meals, still commented on the weather, even though none of them had seen the sky for days. Meanwhile, another family continued living inside the bunker. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda, had also decided not to leave Berlin. Unlike Eva Braun, he didn't come alone. His wife, Magda, and their 6 children were with him. The oldest was only 12, the youngest, just 4 years old. Imagine that for a moment. Outside, one of the largest battles in history was raging. Inside, children still played hide-and-seek in concrete hallways. They raced through the narrow corridors, their laughter echoing off the damp walls. Sometimes they stopped outside Mish's switchboard, curious about the rows of telephones, curious about the blinking lights. To them, the bunker wasn't a symbol of dictatorship. It wasn't the headquarters of a collapsing regime. It was simply home. Children have an extraordinary ability to normalize almost anything. If adults remain calm, they often do too. They didn't understand why explosions shook the ceiling. They didn't understand why strangers constantly whispered. They only knew that everyone kept telling them not to go upstairs. The bunker even had a dog, Hitler's German Shepherd, Blondie. She wandered through the corridors freely. The children adored her. Soldiers scratched behind her ears whenever they had a free moment. In a place dominated by concrete, maps, and impossible decisions, the presence of a dog somehow made everything feel briefly human. History rarely remembers moments like these, but the people who survived often did. Meals continued on schedule, not luxurious meals. Germany's food supplies had long since collapsed. Still, the cooks somehow managed to prepare breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Staff gathered around small tables. Conversations stayed surprisingly ordinary. Someone complained the coffee tasted weak. Someone else wished they had fresh bread. Another quietly mentioned that cigarettes were becoming difficult to find. The war entered every conversation, yet somehow never completely dominated them. Perhaps because talking constantly about death makes it impossible to keep living. Hitler himself had become increasingly isolated. He still attended conferences, still met with senior officials, but afterward, he usually retreated into his private rooms. Those who saw him noticed the changes becoming harder to ignore. His shoulders seemed permanently bent. His left hand trembled noticeably. He walked with slow, careful steps, sometimes dragging one foot slightly behind the other. Witnesses disagreed about many things after the war. Almost all agreed on one point. The physical decline was unmistakable. The man who once dominated enormous crowds now struggled simply to move through a narrow hallway. Yet even then, moments of astonishing normality appeared. One evening, someone brought out a gramophone. Music filled one of the sitting rooms. Not loudly, just enough for people to hear. A secretary later recalled that several staff members quietly danced, not because they felt happy, because for a few minutes, they wanted to remember what ordinary life had once felt like. Outside, artillery shells continued falling. Inside, someone smiled. History is full of contradictions like that. As darkness fell over Berlin, the bunker became even more isolated. Telephone connections failed more frequently. Messengers took longer to arrive. Each report carried worse news than the last. District after district disappeared from German control. The Soviet ring around the government quarter tightened hour by hour. Escape routes that had existed yesterday no longer existed today. People began realizing something they had quietly avoided admitting. Soon, nobody would be leaving. Not because they didn't want to, because there would be nowhere left to go. And while those inside the bunker struggled to understand their future, outside, Soviet soldiers were already fighting street by street, building by building, closing in on the Reich Chancellery itself. The final battle for Berlin had reached Hitler's front door. By April 25th, Berlin no longer resembled a capital city. It resembled the aftermath of the end of the world. The streets that had once carried military parades were now buried beneath bricks, twisted steel, shattered glass, and the remains of buildings that no longer existed. Smoke blocked out much of the sky. The air tasted like burning wood, burning fuel, and burning history. Every few seconds, another explosion rolled across the city. Some were close enough to shake the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Others came from farther away. It didn't matter. The shelling never stopped. For the Soviet soldiers advancing into Berlin, this wasn't simply another battle. It was personal. Many had marched thousands of miles from the gates of Moscow, through Stalingrad, through Kursk, through Belarus, through Poland. They had seen villages erased from the map, families murdered, entire cities reduced to ruins. Now, they had reached the capital of the country that had brought all of that suffering upon them. They weren't fighting for another piece of territory anymore. They were fighting for the end. The advance was unlike anything most soldiers had ever experienced. Open fields were gone. There were no long defensive lines. No sweeping armored maneuvers. Every building had become its own battlefield. A school, a train station, an apartment block, a church. Capture one building, only to discover the next one had already become another fortress. Every intersection had to be won separately. Every basement searched. Every rooftop checked. Progress was measured, not in miles, but in rooms. Inside the bunker, those battles were invisible. The concrete walls blocked the smoke, the flames, the screams, but they couldn't block the vibrations. Every artillery impact sent a dull tremor through the structure. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Coffee rippled inside cups. Light bulbs swayed almost imperceptibly. Nobody flinched anymore. After weeks underground, the explosions had become part of daily life. The silence between them felt stranger. Raucous Mish remained at the switchboard. The telephone still rang constantly. Only now, many of the voices sounded exhausted, desperate. Some lines went dead in the middle of conversations. Not because someone hung up, because another shell had destroyed the telephone cables. Each broken connection usually meant the same thing. Another command post had ceased to exist. Messengers began arriving instead. Young soldiers, covered in dust, faces blackened by smoke, some still carrying helmets with fresh bullet marks. They rushed into the bunker clutching handwritten reports. Many had crossed streets under sniper fire simply to deliver a single piece of paper. Sometimes, the message they carried was already outdated by the time they arrived. The front line had moved again. Food became increasingly difficult to deliver. The kitchens still functioned. Barely. Supplies that once arrived by truck now depended on whatever could survive the journey through burning streets. The meals grew simpler. Soup, bread, potatoes, if available. Nobody complained. There were far more serious problems. Water became another concern. Pipes above ground had been shattered by shellfire. Engineers worked constantly to keep pumps operating beneath the bunker. Without them, groundwater would slowly flood the lower levels. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Even as one of history's most powerful governments collapsed, maintenance crews still had to worry about leaking pipes. Civilization has a way of refusing to stop being ordinary, even during extraordinary moments. Above ground, ordinary Berliners were enduring a nightmare. Families sheltered inside cellars. Parents wrapped blankets around frightened children as artillery shattered nearby buildings. Some ventured outside searching for drinking water. Others searched for missing relatives. Many never returned. Entire neighborhoods had become impossible to cross. One street might appear quiet. The next, covered by machine gun fire. There was no safe route, only less dangerous ones. The hospitals had become overwhelmed. Doctors operated without enough medicine, without enough equipment, sometimes without electricity. Hallways filled with wounded civilians alongside exhausted soldiers. Medical staff worked until they physically could not continue. Then, they kept working anyway, because there was nobody left to replace them. Back inside the bunker, the mood continued changing. Hope had quietly disappeared. Nobody announced it. Nobody voted on it. People simply stopped talking about relief armies, stopped mentioning miracle weapons, stopped pretending. Conversations became shorter, quieter, more personal. People spoke about families, about home, about what they missed. The future had become too uncertain to discuss, so they remembered the past instead. One evening, Eva Braun appeared in the dining room wearing a light-colored dress. Several witnesses later remembered the moment. It seemed strangely elegant, almost festive, completely out of place beneath hundreds of tons of concrete, while Berlin burned overhead. She smiled politely, thanked the kitchen staff, made small conversation. One secretary later admitted that the sight unsettled her, not because Eva seemed frightened, because she didn't. She behaved as though attending an ordinary dinner party. Acceptance can sometimes look remarkably similar to peace. The Goebbels children continued playing in the corridors. Their laughter echoed through the bunker, occasionally mixing with the distant thunder of Soviet artillery. It was one of the strangest contrasts imaginable, children chasing one another, while one of history's greatest battles unfolded only a few hundred feet away. Many survivors would later say those sounds haunted them more than the explosions, because they knew what the children did not. There would be no escape. Then, late one afternoon, the bunker received another message. Not from the battlefield, from outside Germany. It reported that Benito Mussolini, Hitler's longtime ally, had been captured by Italian partisans. He had been executed. His body, along with that of his companion, had been publicly displayed in Milan. The report spread rapidly through the bunker. People whispered. Some refused to believe it. Others immediately understood its significance. If that could happen to Mussolini, what might happen to Hitler? If he were captured alive? The question lingered in every corridor. Nobody dared ask it aloud, but everyone was thinking it. And before the day was over, Hitler would make a decision that would shape everything that followed. By April 28th, the bunker had become a prison, not because the doors were locked, because there was nowhere left to go. Every road leading out of central Berlin was under Soviet fire. Every bridge had become a battlefield. Every hour, the Red Army moved another few hundred yards closer. The walls of the bunker hadn't changed, but somehow, they felt smaller. That evening, another report arrived. At first, it sounded impossible. Then, another message confirmed it. Then another. There could be no mistake. Heinrich Himmler, the man who had stood beside Hitler for years, the head of the SS, had secretly attempted to negotiate Germany's surrender with the Western Allies. Without Hitler's knowledge, without his permission, for years, Himmler had been among Hitler's most loyal followers. Now, even he appeared to believe the war was over. The news spread through the bunker almost instantly. Conversations stopped. People looked at one another in disbelief. If Himmler had abandoned hope, who hadn't? The report reached Hitler late that evening. Those present would later remember the silence. Not another explosion. Not another military defeat. This felt personal. For several moments, he simply stared at the document. Then came the anger. Not the wild explosion from days earlier. Something colder. Sharper. He called Himmler a traitor. Ordered that he be stripped of every office. Declared that betrayal surrounded him. One by one, the men he had trusted most seemed to be disappearing. Some were dead. Some had surrendered. Some had fled. Others were trying to save themselves. The circle around him had never felt smaller. Only a handful of people remained. Joseph Goebbels, Martin Bormann, several secretaries, a few military officers, the communications staff, personal servants, bodyguards, doctors, cooks, telephone operators. Altogether, barely enough people to fill a small apartment building. And every one of them understood something. History was reaching its conclusion. Outside, the Soviet advance continued. The Reichstag could now be seen from Soviet positions. German resistance had become fragmented. Some units continued fighting fiercely. Others no longer received orders. Many commanders simply defended the streets directly in front of them. Communication between different sectors became almost impossible. Berlin was no longer functioning as a coordinated defense. It had become dozens of isolated battles, all happening at once. Inside the bunker, life grew strangely quiet. There were fewer meetings, fewer visitors. Even the telephones rang less frequently. Not because fewer people wanted to call, because many headquarters had simply disappeared. Every disconnected line represented another command post overrun, another building destroyed, another group of men gone. Misch later remembered that silence more than anything else. For weeks, the bunker had been filled with constant activity. Now, it felt as though the building itself was waiting. Late that night, Hitler summoned several members of his personal staff. The meeting was brief. He thanked some of them for their service. Others received permission to attempt escape. Nobody was ordered to stay. That surprised several people. For years, obedience had been absolute. Now, the choice belonged to them. Some decided to remain. Others quietly began preparing for a breakout through Soviet lines. Neither option offered much hope. Then, something unexpected happened. Hitler called for Eva Braun. The two disappeared into his private quarters for some time. Nobody knew exactly what they discussed, only that when they emerged, their decision had been made. Eva still had opportunities to leave. She refused everyone. According to those who later recalled her words, she had no intention of surviving him. Just after midnight, while artillery continued shaking the city above, the bunker prepared for something almost impossible to imagine. A wedding. The contrast bordered on surreal. Outside, Berlin was collapsing. Inside, someone searched for official paperwork. Another located witnesses. A civil official was summoned. The ceremony itself lasted only a few minutes. Simple, quiet, almost ordinary. Adolf Hitler, after spending years carefully avoiding marriage, finally married Eva Braun. Not at the height of his power, not after military victory, not inside a grand hall filled with cheering crowds, but beneath thousands of tons of concrete. While one of history's greatest battles raged overhead, the timing seemed almost unbelievable. Yet it happened. After signing the marriage register, the newlyweds briefly greeted those gathered nearby. Several secretaries later remembered sharing a modest toast. Champagne was served. A few polite congratulations were exchanged. Someone even smiled. For a brief moment, the bunker almost resembled an ordinary family celebration. Then another artillery barrage rolled across Berlin. The walls trembled. Reality returned. Later that night, Hitler sat down at his desk. Several secretaries waited nearby with typewriters. He began dictating what would become his final political statement. His voice remained steady. Occasionally he paused, searching for the next sentence. Page after page, the secretaries typed. Outside, the city continued dying. Inside, History was being recorded one final time. When the dictation finished, the documents were signed. Witnesses added their names. Copies were prepared. Messengers received instructions to carry them out of Berlin if possible. It was an extraordinary task. The men delivering them would have to cross a city almost entirely surrounded by Soviet forces. Some would never return. As dawn approached, the bunker grew quiet again. Very quiet. Most people tried to sleep. Few succeeded. Everyone sensed that something irreversible had begun. The wedding. The final testament. The farewells. Taken together, they pointed toward one unavoidable conclusion. Hitler had stopped planning for Germany's future. He was now planning only for his own end. And within less than 24 hours, the most infamous dictator of the 20th century would walk into a small private room, close the door behind him, and make a decision that would echo through history forever. Morning came, although no one inside the bunker could actually see it. There were no windows, no sunrise, no golden light creeping across the floor. Only the same harsh electric bulbs that had burned day and night for weeks. Time underground had become something measured by clocks, not by the sky. It was April 30th, 1945. The Third Reich had less than 24 hours left to live. Few people inside the bunker realized it. Even fewer would survive to tell the story. Above ground, the Battle of Berlin had reached its climax. Soviet soldiers were now only a few hundred yards from the Reich Chancellery. Machine gun fire echoed through nearby streets. Tank engines could sometimes be heard between artillery barges. The fighting was no longer somewhere else. It had arrived at Hitler's doorstep. Every explosion seemed louder than the last. Dust drifted constantly from the bunker's ceiling. Coffee cups rattled across tables. Nobody reacted anymore. There was simply no energy left for surprise. Raucous Mish took his usual position at the telephone switchboard. The room felt strangely quiet. Not because there were fewer calls, because there were fewer people left to call. Entire headquarters had vanished. Commanders who had spoken yesterday were silent today. Some telephones rang endlessly without anyone answering. Others never rang again. Little by little, the communications network holding Germany together had simply stopped existing. Around midday, Hitler emerged from his private quarters. Witnesses later described him as calm, not cheerful, not optimistic, just calm. The frantic anger of previous days had disappeared. The shouting, the arguments, the impossible military orders, gone. In their place stood a man who appeared to have accepted that nothing more could be done. Sometimes, acceptance can be more unsettling than panic. He walked slowly through the corridor, stopping occasionally to speak with members of his personal staff. One by one, he shook hands. Some people received quiet words of thanks. Others were told they were free to attempt escape if they wished. Several secretaries later recalled how ordinary the conversations sounded. There were no dramatic speeches, no emotional farewells, just short, almost polite exchanges, as though he were leaving for a journey, rather than preparing for death. Shortly afterward, lunch was served. The meal itself was modest. Simple pasta, vegetables, nothing extravagant. Hitler had been a vegetarian for years. Those gathered around the table noticed he barely ate. Conversation came slowly. Nobody seemed eager to speak. Outside, another artillery barrage shook the bunker. Some dust fell from the ceiling. Someone quietly brushed it from the tablecloth. Then everyone continued eating. History has a strange way of making extraordinary moments feel painfully ordinary. After lunch, Hitler summoned several of his closest aides. The meeting lasted only a short time. He reviewed a few final administrative matters, asked about messages that still needed delivering, confirmed that his political testament had been prepared. There was almost no discussion of military operations anymore. The war, for him, was already over. Then came one final concern. Blondie, his German shepherd. The dog had remained with him throughout the final months of the war. Many members of the bunker staff had grown fond of her. She wandered freely through the corridors, accepted treats from guards, played with the Goebbels children. To many, she was one of the few reminders that ordinary life had once existed. Now, Hitler wanted absolute certainty that the cyanide capsules he intended to use actually worked. A military doctor administered one to Blondie. Within moments, the dog collapsed. She never recovered. Several witnesses later described that moment as one of the most disturbing events they experienced inside the bunker. Not because of what happened, because of the silence afterward. No one knew what to say. The afternoon passed slowly, painfully slowly. People found small tasks to occupy themselves. Some packed belongings. Others destroyed confidential documents. Stacks of papers disappeared into furnaces. Maps burned. Files burned. Reports burned. Years of government records vanished in smoke. The Third Reich was erasing itself. Around 3 o'clock, Hitler emerged one final time. Eva Braun stood beside him. She wore a simple dark blue dress. Nothing extravagant. Nothing resembling the glamorous photographs taken years earlier at the Berghof. Just an ordinary dress. For an extraordinary afternoon. Together, they walked slowly through the corridor, stopping every few steps, shaking hands, offering quiet farewells. Several people struggled to find words. Others simply nodded. Nobody knew what farewell was appropriate in a moment like this. When they reached the doorway to Hitler's private sitting room, they paused. He turned toward those gathered nearby, raised his hand briefly, then stepped inside. Eva followed. The door closed. Softly. No dramatic slam. No final speech. Just a door quietly shutting. Outside the room, time seemed to stop. Nobody spoke. Some stared at the floor. Others looked toward the closed door. The bunker suddenly felt impossibly still. Even the constant hum of generators seemed strangely distant. Minutes passed. 5. Perhaps 10. No one later agreed exactly how long. Then, a single sharp sound echoed through the corridor. A gunshot. Just one. Nothing followed. Nobody moved immediately. Perhaps because everyone already understood. Perhaps because no one wanted to be the first to open the door. Finally, Hitler's valet and several aides stepped forward. The handle turned. The door slowly opened. Inside, the room was silent. The war, at least for Adolf Hitler, had ended. The instructions he had given days earlier were carried out almost immediately. The bodies were wrapped in blankets, carried through the bunker, up the narrow staircase, and into the shattered garden above. The shelling hadn't stopped. Soviet artillery continued striking nearby. Fragments of masonry flew through the air. Smoke drifted across the ruined courtyard. Working as quickly as possible, those present placed the bodies inside a shell crater. Fuel was poured over them. Several cans. Everything they could find. Then, someone struck a match. Flames rose into the afternoon air, visible only briefly, before smoke swallowed them. The people standing nearby saluted. Not for long. The shelling forced them back underground almost immediately. The garden had become too dangerous to remain in. When the heavy bunker door closed once more, an eerie realization settled over everyone inside. The man whose decisions had plunged Europe into 6 years of catastrophic war was gone. But the battle wasn't. Above them, Berlin continued to burn. Soviet troops continued advancing. Machine guns continued firing. The Third Reich hadn't ended the moment Hitler died. It simply continued. Without him, and for the people still trapped beneath the Reich Chancellery. The most dangerous part of their story was only just beginning. For a few brief minutes, the fire burned. Then, it began to die. Not because there wasn't enough fuel. There wasn't. But because Soviet artillery made it almost impossible for anyone to remain outside. Shells continued exploding across the Reich Chancellery gardens. Chunks of concrete rained from shattered walls. Tree branches crashed to the ground. Anyone lingering outside risked becoming the next casualty. So the men who had carried out Hitler's final orders did the only thing they could. They retreated underground, leaving the burning bodies behind. Inside the bunker, nobody celebrated. Nobody mourned publicly either. The mood wasn't relief. It wasn't triumph. It was exhaustion. Months of constant pressure had drained almost every emotion people had left. Several staff members quietly returned to work. Others simply sat in silence. The telephone still rang. Messages still needed delivering. The war, despite everything, continued. For Raucous Mish, very little changed. His switchboard remained busy. Lines still connected what remained of German military headquarters. The conversations had become shorter now. Many commanders no longer asked for reinforcements. They asked for permission to withdraw, or confirmation that neighboring units still existed. Often, nobody could answer. Entire sections of Berlin had disappeared from the communications network. The city wasn't simply being defeated. It was being cut apart, one neighborhood at a time. Meanwhile, Joseph Goebbels quietly stepped into a role no one truly envied. According to Hitler's political testament, Goebbels had become Reich Chancellor. On paper, he now led Germany. In reality, he ruled little more than an underground bunker surrounded by Soviet troops. The title itself had become almost meaningless. History sometimes produces strange ironies. One of the highest offices in Europe, held for less than 24 hours, inside a city that no longer functioned. Goebbels still hoped for one thing: negotiation, not victory. That dream had died days earlier. He wanted terms, some agreement that might spare what remained of Berlin. Messengers attempted to contact Soviet commanders. The response was immediate. Only unconditional surrender would be accepted, nothing else. There would be no compromise, no separate peace, no miracle. Inside the bunker, the implications became obvious. If surrender wasn't accepted, there were only two possibilities left: fight or escape. Several officers immediately began planning breakout attempts. Maps spread across tables once again, not to launch counterattacks, to identify streets that might still be passable. Every route looked terrible. Most crossed territory already controlled by Soviet troops. Others passed through neighborhoods under constant artillery fire. None offered good odds. They merely offered slightly better ones. The secretaries faced impossible decisions. Many were young women in their 20s. They had followed orders, typed reports, filed documents. Now, they had to decide whether to remain in the bunker or attempt escape through a city collapsing around them. Some packed small bags. Others burned personal papers. Several later admitted they never expected to survive. They simply wanted the chance to try. One room, however, remained strangely peaceful. The Goebbels children were asleep. They knew nothing about Hitler's death, nothing about surrender, nothing about the impossible choices facing the adults around them. Their toys remained neatly arranged beside their beds, blankets tucked carefully around them. The youngest still clutched a stuffed animal while sleeping. Looking through the doorway, it would have been impossible to guess that history was ending only a few rooms away. Sometimes, innocence survives longest, because it doesn't yet understand what it should fear. Above ground, Soviet soldiers continued pushing toward the Reichstag. The battle had become brutal beyond imagination. Every basement concealed potential defenders. Every window could hide a sniper. Every staircase became a deadly choke point. Flamethrowers, hand grenades, machine guns. The fighting often occurred at distances measured in feet, not yards. Entire apartment buildings changed hands several times in a single day. The closer Soviet troops came to the government district, the fiercer the resistance became. German defenders understood exactly what they were protecting, even if they no longer believed they could save it. Late that evening, another meeting gathered inside the bunker. Only a handful of people attended. The discussion lasted barely 20 minutes. There wasn't much left to decide. Documents that could not fall into enemy hands would be destroyed. Personnel were free to attempt escape after dark. Those remaining would stay until the very end. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. The shouting had ended with Hitler. Now, there was only quiet acceptance. As midnight approached, small groups began leaving. one by one, not together. Moving in large numbers would attract attention. Each person carried almost nothing. A pistol, perhaps a map, a small amount of food. Some tucked family photographs into their pockets. Others carried cyanide capsules instead. Each understood the risk. Capture by Soviet troops remained a real possibility. Many believed death preferable. Whether history judges those decisions harshly or sympathetically, they reflected the desperate reality of Berlin's final hours. Raucous Mish remained. The switchboard still needed someone, even though fewer and fewer lines remained connected. He later admitted that staying wasn't really a conscious decision. It was simply his job. After months underground, routine had become stronger than fear. Answer the telephone. Connect the call. Wait for the next one. Repeat. Even as the world above disappeared. Outside, night settled over Berlin, or what remained of it. Flames illuminated shattered buildings with an orange glow. Smoke drifted across empty streets. The thunder of artillery rolled almost continuously across the city. Somewhere beyond that darkness, Soviet soldiers were already entering the government quarter. Every hour, they moved closer to the Reich Chancellery, closer to the bunker, closer to the answers they had been searching for. Because when they finally reached Hitler's headquarters, they expected to capture the most wanted man in the world. Instead, they would discover something far stranger. A bunker full of exhausted survivors. A dictator who had vanished. And the beginning of one of the greatest mysteries of the Second World War. How do you prove someone is dead when almost all that's left is ash? By the morning of May 1st, the fighting had become almost unimaginably close. For days, the men and women inside the bunker had listened to the war creeping toward them. Now, it wasn't creeping anymore. It had arrived. The explosions no longer echoed from distant neighborhoods. They came from the streets directly above. Every artillery blast rattled the bunker. Every burst of machine gun fire sounded as though it might punch straight through the ceiling. The Red Army had reached the government district. The end was only a matter of time. For the Soviet soldiers, this was the moment they had marched toward for nearly 4 years. From the smoking ruins outside Moscow, to the frozen banks of the Volga, through Kursk, Belarus, Poland, and finally, Berlin. Every mile had carried unimaginable cost. Entire divisions had vanished. Millions of Soviet soldiers had died reaching the German capital. Now, they stood only a few hundred yards from the Reich Chancellery. The building that had once symbolized Hitler's power had become little more than another battlefield. Inside the bunker, the telephones had almost fallen silent. Not because people had stopped calling, because there was almost nobody left to answer. Lines had been cut, switchboards destroyed, command posts overrun. One by one, the connections simply disappeared. Raucous Mish continued sitting before the switchboard, listening to the occasional ring, connecting the few calls that still came through. Even he understood. His job was ending. Not because someone had dismissed him, because Germany itself was disappearing. Meanwhile, Joseph Goebbels still refused to surrender. Throughout the morning, he attempted one final negotiation. Messages were sent to the Soviet command requesting a ceasefire. Not victory. Not escape. Simply, talks. The Soviet reply arrived quickly. There would be no negotiations. Only unconditional surrender. Nothing had changed. Nothing would. That answer sealed everyone's fate. The bunker staff no longer debated what might happen. They discussed only when. Some continued packing. Others quietly loaded pistols. Several checked the small cyanide capsules hidden inside their pockets. Nobody wanted to say the words aloud, but everyone understood. Capture was becoming unavoidable. Throughout the day, small groups attempted to leave, usually after dark, usually through shattered exits leading into the ruins above. Some slipped through the Soviet lines. Many didn't. Nobody inside the bunker knew which was which. People simply disappeared into the night. Occasionally, distant bursts of gunfire echoed through the streets. No one asked questions afterward. Sometimes, not knowing felt easier. Late that afternoon, An unsettling silence settled across part of the bunker. The Goebbels children had disappeared from the corridors. No laughter, no footsteps, no whispered games. The change was immediately noticeable. Only later would survivors understand why. The children would never leave the bunker alive. Their story remains one of the darkest chapters of the final days in Berlin. Even decades later, many survivors struggled to speak about it. Some simply refused. By evening, the government above ground had effectively ceased to exist. The Reichstag had fallen. The Soviet flag now flew above its shattered roof. For Soviet soldiers, it represented the victory they had sacrificed so much to achieve. For those still hiding underground, it marked the end of every illusion. There would be no relief, no rescue, no final counterattack. The Third Reich had become little more than a few rooms beneath broken concrete. As darkness returned, Berlin looked almost unreal. Entire city blocks glowed with fire. Smoke drifted across streets filled with abandoned vehicles. Collapsed buildings cast long shadows beneath burning skies. The city that had once been one of Europe's greatest capitals had become a landscape of ruins. Soviet patrols moved cautiously between shattered buildings. Every doorway remained dangerous. Every basement might still contain armed defenders. The battle continued, even though its outcome no longer remained in doubt. Then, during the night of May 1st, Joseph Goebbels and his wife made their final decision. They had already decided their children would not survive the fall of the Third Reich. Now, they chose the same path for themselves. When Soviet investigators eventually entered the Chancellery Garden, they would discover two more bodies. Another tragic ending, inside a city already overwhelmed by death. By the early hours of May 2nd, only a handful of people remained inside the bunker. Rakus Mish was one of them. He later remembered walking through corridors that had once been crowded with officers, secretaries, cooks, guards, and messengers. Now, many rooms stood empty. Coffee cups remained where people had left them. Maps still covered the walls. Typewriters sat beside unfinished documents. The bunker looked less like a headquarters, and more like a place whose occupants had simply vanished. Then, the sound everyone had expected finally arrived. Heavy footsteps. Not German. Soviet. Voices echoed somewhere above. Doors slammed. Orders were shouted in Russian. The battle had reached the entrance. For months, Hitler's headquarters had remained hidden beneath Berlin. Now, the Red Army was standing directly over it. The men who had crossed half of Europe to capture Adolf Hitler were only moments away from discovering that they were already 2 days too late. But what they found next would confuse them completely, because Hitler's body wasn't lying in the bunker. It wasn't sitting behind a desk. It wasn't waiting inside a locked room. Instead, it seemed to have disappeared. The Soviet soldiers expected many things when they entered Hitler's headquarters. A final gunfight, booby traps, perhaps even Adolf Hitler himself. What they didn't expect was emptiness. On the morning of May 2nd, 1945, the last organized German resistance inside central Berlin finally collapsed. White flags began appearing from shattered buildings. Groups of exhausted German soldiers emerged with their hands raised. Others simply dropped their weapons and walked away from positions they had defended for days. The battle for Berlin was over, but one question remained unanswered. Where was Hitler? For months, the Soviet High Command had built the final offensive around one objective: capture Berlin, capture Hitler. Joseph Stalin wanted proof. Not rumors, not assumptions. Proof. If Hitler had escaped, the war might not truly be over. If he had been captured by the Western Allies, the political consequences would be enormous. If he was dead, his body had to be found. No uncertainty could be allowed. Soviet assault teams pushed through the shattered Reich Chancellery. The once grand government building barely resembled the photographs taken before the war. Marble staircases had collapsed. Walls were ripped open by artillery. Ceilings had fallen onto expensive furniture. Every room carried the smell of smoke. dust, and explosives. It looked less like a government headquarters, and more like the skeleton of a city. Eventually, someone found the staircase. It led downward, deep beneath the ruined building. Heavy steel doors blocked the entrance. Some had already been forced open. Others still stood slightly ajar. The soldiers descended cautiously, weapons raised. No one knew what waited below. The bunker felt strangely alive, despite being almost empty. Electric lights still burned. Generators still hummed somewhere behind the walls. Water pumps continued their endless rhythm. Coffee cups sat on tables. Beds remained unmade. Typewriters rested beside unfinished pages. It looked as though people had simply stepped outside and forgotten to come back. The corridors stretched ahead exactly as raucous Mish had remembered them. Narrow, damp, oppressive. Only now, they echoed with Russian voices instead of German ones. The bunker had changed owners. Almost overnight, the Soviet soldiers searched every room. Bedrooms, storage closets, the communications room, the conference room with its enormous military maps still hanging on the walls. Some officers paused before the maps. Red arrows, blue markings, handwritten notes. The final plans of a government that no longer existed. Everything had been abandoned exactly where it was left. Then they entered Hitler's private quarters. The room was surprisingly modest. Not luxurious. Not decorated like the palace many imagined. A sofa, several chairs, bookshelves, a desk, personal photographs. Everything looked strangely ordinary. Almost disappointingly ordinary. History often expects monsters to live inside monstrous places. Reality is usually far less dramatic. The investigators immediately noticed something else. Blood. Not much. Just a dark stain on the arm of a sofa. Nearby, a spent pistol cartridge lay on the carpet. The furniture showed clear signs that something had happened here. But there was one enormous problem. The body was gone. At first, many Soviet officers refused to believe Hitler was dead. Some assumed he had escaped through hidden tunnels. Others believed he had fled hours before the bunker fell. Rumors spread rapidly. Perhaps he had escaped by aircraft. Perhaps by submarine. Perhaps he was already hiding somewhere in Bavaria. Nobody knew. The uncertainty frustrated everyone, especially Stalin. Meanwhile, Soviet soldiers continued questioning everyone they captured. Secretaries, guards, doctors, telephone operators, kitchen staff, anyone who had been inside the bunker during its final days. The stories sounded remarkably similar. Hitler had remained in Berlin. He had died on April 30th. His body had been carried into the garden, burned, buried beneath shell craters. Again and again, the witnesses repeated the same sequence of events, yet without physical evidence. The Soviet leadership remained skeptical. Witnesses could lie. Bodies could not. Search teams spread across the Reich Chancellery Garden. Calling it a garden hardly seemed accurate anymore. Artillery had transformed it into a wasteland. Trees had been blasted apart. Flower beds had disappeared beneath shell craters. Broken masonry covered nearly every inch of ground. Finding anything here felt almost impossible. Still, the search continued. Hour after hour, soldiers dug through mud, ash, twisted roots, fragments of concrete, looking for anything that might explain what had happened. Then, someone noticed disturbed earth. It wasn't obvious, just a shallow crater that looked slightly different from the surrounding ground. Engineers began digging. Slowly, carefully. The deeper they went, the stronger the smell became. Burned flesh, burned fuel, burned fabric. Then, the first remains appeared. Not an intact body. Fragments, blackened bones, pieces of clothing, burned leather, metal buttons fused together by heat. The fire had done exactly what Hitler intended. Almost nothing remained. The investigators recovered everything they could find. Several bodies, all badly burned. None immediately recognizable. Among them, they believed, were Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun. But belief wasn't enough. The Soviet leadership demanded certainty. Absolute certainty. And that presented an extraordinary challenge. How do you identify someone whose body has been almost completely destroyed? The answer would come from something so small that most people would have overlooked it entirely. Not fingerprints, not clothing, not photographs. Teeth. A handful of burned dental remains would ultimately solve one of the greatest mysteries of the Second World War, and at the same time, create another mystery that would survive for nearly half a century. At first glance, the remains told investigators almost nothing. The bodies had been burned exactly as Hitler had ordered. Gasoline had soaked the corpses. Flames had consumed clothing, skin, muscle, until little remained but blackened fragments buried beneath dirt and rubble. If this had been any ordinary investigation, it might have ended there. There simply wasn't enough left to identify anyone with certainty. But Adolf Hitler wasn't an ordinary case. He was the most wanted man on earth. And Stalin wanted proof, not probability. Proof. The remains were quietly removed from the garden. Not with ceremony, not with photographers. Only a small team of Soviet counterintelligence officers knew exactly what had been found. Even among the Red Army, information was tightly controlled. The fewer people who knew, the easier it would be to keep the discovery secret. The bodies were transported to a temporary Soviet facility outside Berlin. There, the examination began. Almost immediately, the investigators encountered a problem. The faces were gone. The intense fire had destroyed nearly every recognizable feature. Clothing offered only limited clues. Uniform fragments, buttons, pieces of fabric. Useful, but not conclusive. They needed something impossible to fake. Something that could survive fire. Something unique. Then one of the forensic officers noticed something remarkable. Part of the jaw had survived. Not perfectly, but well enough. Several artificial dental bridges remained attached. Gold crowns, metalwork, fragments of porcelain. Fire had destroyed almost everything else. But dentistry had endured. At that moment, the entire investigation changed. Every person's teeth tell a story. Cavities, fillings, missing teeth, crowns, bridges. Years of dental work create a pattern almost as unique as fingerprints. And Adolf Hitler had undergone extensive dental treatment throughout his life. If investigators could locate the people who treated him, they might finally have their answer. Finding those people proved easier than expected. Berlin had fallen quickly. Many government workers had never escaped. Among those captured by Soviet forces were members of Hitler's dental staff, his dental assistant, and his dental technician. Neither knew why they had suddenly been arrested, only that Soviet officers urgently wanted answers. The investigators placed the burned dental remains on a table. Then, without saying whose remains they believed they had found, they asked a simple question. Do you recognize this work? The assistant leaned forward, studied the fragments carefully. Her expression changed almost immediately. She pointed toward one of the bridges, then another, then the gold crown. According to later Soviet reports, she identified them almost instantly. She recognized the bridge she had personally helped construct. The unusual arrangement of crowns. The distinctive dental work performed only weeks before Berlin fell. She wasn't guessing. She remembered. To verify the identification, the investigators produced Hitler's dental records. X-rays, treatment notes, technical diagrams. Everything matched. The placement of every bridge, every crown, every repaired tooth. One by one, the evidence aligned perfectly. The burned jaw belonged to Adolf Hitler. The second set of dental remains matched Eva Braun. The mystery, at least scientifically, had been solved. Today, forensic experts still regard dental identification as one of the most reliable methods available when fingerprints or facial recognition are impossible. Human teeth are remarkably resilient. They routinely survive temperatures that destroy nearly everything else. Even decades later, modern researchers comparing the surviving dental fragments with historical records reached the same conclusion. The identification was correct. Yet strangely, the Soviet Union didn't celebrate the discovery. They didn't hold a press conference. They didn't publish the evidence. They didn't show the remains to the world. Instead, they did something that would confuse historians for generations. They locked everything away. The recovered remains were buried secretly. Only a handful of senior Soviet officials knew the location. Reports were classified. Witnesses remained under tight control. Even many Soviet officers involved in Berlin never learned what investigators had actually found. To the outside world, Hitler's fate remained uncertain. Official statements contradicted one another. Sometimes Soviet officials hinted he had escaped. Other times, they refused to comment at all. The confusion wasn't accidental. It had been created deliberately. Joseph Stalin had his own reasons. Keeping Hitler's fate uncertain created political advantages. As long as nobody knew for certain whether Hitler had escaped, suspicion remained. Perhaps the Western allies were hiding him. Perhaps someone had secretly helped him flee. Perhaps there was another explanation. Uncertainty became a useful political weapon, and Stalin understood better than almost anyone that information could be just as powerful as armies. Meanwhile, ordinary Soviet soldiers who had fought their way into Berlin returned home believing many different stories. Some were convinced Hitler had died. Others believed he'd escaped. Rumors spread across Europe almost immediately. Argentina, Spain, Norway, secret submarines, hidden mountain fortresses. Every few weeks, another story appeared, each one more dramatic than the last. The truth sat quietly inside classified Soviet archives, locked away, unknown to almost everyone. Ironically, the evidence proving Hitler's death already existed. It simply wasn't being shown to anyone. A handful of burned teeth, hidden inside Soviet files, held the answer to one of history's greatest questions. But because those files remained secret, the world began creating its own answers instead. And once those stories began spreading, they became almost impossible to stop. Because sometimes, people find extraordinary conspiracies far more satisfying than ordinary truth. If the story had ended there, history would have been remarkably straightforward. Hitler died. His remains were identified. The evidence matched. Case closed. But history rarely rewards simplicity. Instead, the Soviet Union made a decision that would confuse the entire world for decades. They buried the truth. Literally. After the identification was complete, the remains didn't stay in Berlin. Soviet security officers quietly moved them from one secret location to another. Not once, several times. Each relocation became more secretive than the last. Only a tiny circle of intelligence officers knew exactly where the graves were. Everyone else, including many senior Soviet officials, was left guessing. The fewer people who knew, the easier the secret became to protect. Officially, almost nothing was announced. The Soviet press remained silent. Western journalists asked questions. They received vague answers. Sometimes, no answers at all. It wasn't simply government secrecy. It was carefully managed uncertainty. And uncertainty has a remarkable effect on people. Whenever facts disappear, stories rush in to replace them. Meanwhile, Joseph Stalin seemed almost uninterested in ending the speculation. In fact, there's considerable evidence that he encouraged it. At international meetings, he occasionally hinted that Hitler might have escaped. Not directly, never with proof, just enough to keep people wondering. Imagine hearing that from the leader of the Soviet Union, the man whose army had actually captured Berlin. If he wasn't certain, who could be? Those brief comments echoed around the world. Newspapers printed them. Politicians repeated them. The rumors multiplied almost overnight. Before long, the first sightings began. Someone claimed Hitler had boarded an aircraft at the last moment. Another insisted a submarine had carried him safely across the Atlantic. A fisherman supposedly spotted German officers unloading mysterious cargo somewhere in South America. Every few weeks, another incredible story surfaced. Each one promised the same thing. The Führer had escaped. He was still alive. He was waiting. None of the stories matched. None agreed on where he'd gone. But that hardly mattered. Because conspiracy theories rarely survive through evidence. They survive through possibility. South America quickly became the favorite destination, partly because several former Nazis genuinely did escape there after the war. Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, those were real escape routes. Real fugitives used them. So when someone claimed Hitler had done the same, the story sounded plausible, even if no evidence supported it. One true fact, surrounded by several invented ones, creates an unusually convincing myth. The rumors grew stranger with time. Hidden compounds deep inside the Andes. Secret Nazi colonies. Underground laboratories. Entire villages supposedly filled with former SS officers protecting Hitler into old age. Books appeared claiming to reveal the real truth. Documentaries followed. Witnesses emerged decades after the war insisting they'd seen him. Each story contradicted the last. That didn't stop people from believing them. Sometimes, the more mysterious a story becomes, the more attractive it seems. Even the FBI received reports. Letters arrived from ordinary citizens convinced they had discovered Hitler's hiding place. One claimed he lived quietly as a farmer. Another insisted he'd undergone plastic surgery. Others described elaborate underground bunkers hidden beneath remote jungles. Agents investigated many of the claims. They interviewed witnesses, examined photographs, followed leads stretching across South America. Again and again, they found nothing, because there was nothing to find. Back in the Soviet Union, the real evidence remained locked away. The dental records, the forensic reports, witness statements, photographs. Almost everything stayed inside classified archives. Historians couldn't examine them. Scientists couldn't verify them. The absence of evidence didn't prove the conspiracy theories, but it gave them room to grow. People often mistake missing information for hidden information. They're not the same thing. Years became decades. The Cold War intensified. Relations between East and West deteriorated. Neither side trusted the other. So when Soviet officials insisted they possessed proof, many people simply refused to believe them. And when they refused to show the evidence, that disbelief only grew stronger. Ironically, the Soviet government had created exactly the mystery it hoped to control. By the 1960s, Hitler had supposedly been seen almost everywhere. Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Colombia, even Antarctica appeared in some stories. One book claimed he lived inside a mountain fortress. Another suggested he'd escaped aboard a fleet of submarines carrying priceless Nazi treasure. Each new theory became more dramatic than the last. Almost none contained verifiable evidence. But they sold books, and that's often enough to keep a myth alive. Meanwhile, deep inside Soviet archives, the answer remained astonishingly ordinary. A burned jawbone, several damaged teeth, a handful of forensic reports, no elaborate escape, no hidden empire, no secret army waiting to return. Just the remains of a man who had chosen death inside a concrete bunker rather than face capture. Sometimes, history's real ending isn't exciting enough for people, so they invent another one. And for nearly 50 years, that's exactly what much of the world did. But eventually, the Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. Archives that had remained sealed for generations slowly began opening. And when modern historians finally examined the evidence for themselves, they reached exactly the same conclusion Soviet investigators had reached back in 1945. The mystery had never really been about Hitler's death. It had been about why the truth had been hidden for so long. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, something unexpected happened. It wasn't another revolution. It wasn't another war. It was quieter than that. Locked doors began opening. Archives that had remained sealed for nearly half a century slowly became accessible to historians. Dust-covered folders, forgotten photographs, classified intelligence reports, documents no outsider had ever been allowed to read. For the first time, People could finally compare decades of rumors against the original evidence. Historians arrived with one question above all others. Did the Soviet investigators really know the truth in 1945? Or had they simply convinced themselves they had? The answer waited inside thousands of pages of reports. Every interview, every sketch, every forensic examination, every witness statement. Piece by piece, the investigation came back to life. One of the first surprises was how methodical the Soviet investigators had actually been. Popular culture often portrays them as careless or politically motivated. Certainly, politics influenced what happened afterward, but the original investigation itself was remarkably thorough. Witnesses were questioned separately, statements were compared, timelines were reconstructed, locations carefully documented, contradictions investigated. Again and again, different witnesses described almost exactly the same sequence of events. Hitler died inside the bunker. His body was carried upstairs. Gasoline was poured over it. The remains were burned in the Reich Chancellery Garden. None of the witnesses knew every detail, but together, their stories fit together with surprising precision. Then came the photographs. Not dramatic photographs. Not the kind printed in newspapers. Simple investigation photos. Shallow graves. Burned remains. Damaged uniforms. The shell crater where Hitler's body had been set on fire. To modern historians, they weren't exciting. They were something much more valuable. Evidence. Next came the forensic reports. Every recovered fragment had been catalogued, measured, compared. The investigators described exactly where each piece had been found, exactly what condition it was in, exactly why they believed it belonged to Hitler or Eva Braun. Reading the reports today, one thing becomes immediately obvious. The investigators weren't guessing. They were documenting. Then, perhaps most importantly, came the witness interviews. Rokas Misch, Heinz Ling, Otto Gunsch, Traudl Junge, secretaries, doctors, guards, telephone operators. Each remembered different details. One recalled the final lunch. Another remembered carrying gasoline cans. Someone else remembered hearing the gunshot. No individual witness saw everything. That would have been impossible. But together, their memories formed something remarkably complete, like assembling thousands of tiny pieces into a single photograph. Modern historians noticed something else. The witnesses frequently disagreed about small details. Exactly what time something happened, which room someone entered first, who stood where. At first, that might seem like a weakness. In reality, it's often the opposite. When dozens of witnesses tell exactly the same story, word for word, investigators become suspicious. Real memory doesn't work that way. People remember different angles, different sounds, different emotions. The small disagreements actually strengthen the overall picture, because despite those differences, the central story never changed. Meanwhile, forensic science had advanced enormously since 1945. New technology allowed researchers to study the surviving dental remains again, more carefully than ever before. The results were striking. Every examination reached essentially the same conclusion. The dental evidence matched Hitler's records. The bridgework, the crowns, the missing teeth, the repairs, everything aligned. Science, decades later, confirmed what Soviet investigators had concluded almost immediately after the war. Then another surprising discovery emerged. The Soviet Union hadn't actually destroyed all the evidence. Some pieces had survived. Among them, the famous jaw fragment, several teeth, and part of the dental bridge. Small objects, easy to overlook. Yet together, they represented perhaps the strongest forensic evidence in one of history's most debated deaths. In 2017, a team of French forensic experts was granted rare access to examine those remains directly. For decades, very few independent researchers had ever been allowed near them. Now, modern specialists could study the evidence using techniques unavailable during the Second World War. The conclusions were remarkably straightforward. The teeth matched Hitler's known dental records. Microscopic examination revealed no signs of fabrication. Chemical analysis showed damage entirely consistent with the historical accounts. After 70 years, the science still pointed in exactly the same direction. One researcher later summarized the findings in surprisingly simple language. There was no mystery left, only mythology. The evidence consistently supported the same conclusion reached in 1945. Hitler had died in Berlin. His body had been burned. The surviving dental remains proved it. Yet despite all this, the conspiracy theories never truly disappeared. Some people simply dismissed the evidence. Others argued the Soviets had forged everything. Still others insisted every witness had somehow participated in an impossible deception lasting generations. The theories adapted. Every new piece of evidence became part of an even larger conspiracy. It's a fascinating pattern. Sometimes, once people commit to believing an extraordinary story, ordinary evidence no longer changes their minds. But history doesn't depend on belief. It depends on evidence. And after decades of investigation, forensic science, archival research, and witness testimony, the evidence points overwhelmingly in one direction. Not toward Argentina, not toward hidden submarines, not toward secret mountain fortresses, toward a small concrete bunker beneath Berlin, toward a gunshot on the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, toward burned remains recovered from a shell crater, and toward a handful of damaged teeth that quietly solved one of history's greatest mysteries. But there's still one final question. If the truth has been known for decades, why does Hitler's bunker remain almost invisible today? Why isn't one of history's most infamous places marked with grand memorials, or preserved like other historic landmarks? The answer says just as much about modern Germany as it does about the bunker itself. Today, if you walk through central Berlin looking for Hitler's bunker, you'll probably miss it. Not because it's hidden, because it almost doesn't exist anymore. There are no towering monuments, no preserved underground museum, no grand entrance with guided tours. Instead, you'll find something surprisingly ordinary. An apartment complex, a parking area, a few trees, people walking dogs, children riding bicycles, office workers hurrying home. Most pass through without giving the ground beneath their feet a second thought. And that's entirely intentional. When the war ended, the bunker remained underground. The Soviets briefly used parts of it. Then, they sealed sections with explosives. Concrete corridors collapsed. Entrances disappeared beneath rubble. The goal wasn't preservation. It was erasure. Nobody wanted Hitler's final headquarters becoming a shrine. Later, East Germany inherited the site. Its leaders faced an uncomfortable question. What do you do with one of the most infamous locations in modern history? Turn it into a museum? Too dangerous. Destroy it completely? Almost impossible. The reinforced concrete walls were extraordinarily thick. Even powerful demolition equipment struggled to break them apart. So, they chose another solution. Ignore it. Build around it. Let time bury it. For decades, that's exactly what happened. Apartment buildings rose above the old bunker. Roads changed direction. Parking lots covered former entrances. Entire generations grew up nearby without realizing what lay beneath the ground. The place slowly faded from public memory. Not because people forgot history, because Germany made a conscious decision not to glorify it. That decision wasn't made lightly. After the war, Germany spent decades confronting one of the darkest chapters in its history. Museums documented Nazi crimes. Memorials honored victims. Former concentration camps were preserved as places of remembrance. But Hitler himself was treated differently. German officials feared that preserving his bunker too prominently might attract extremists. People searching not for history, but for symbolism. The bunker wasn't allowed to become a destination. History would be remembered. The dictator would not be celebrated. For years, there wasn't even a sign explaining where the bunker had been. Tourists wandered the neighborhood carrying old maps. Some knocked on nearby doors asking residents if they knew the location. Others stood in parking lots wondering if they were in the right place. Many left disappointed. It seemed impossible that one of history's most famous locations could simply vanish. Eventually, Berlin authorities accepted reality. People weren't going to stop searching. So rather than allow myths to flourish, they installed a simple informational display. Nothing dramatic, just a modest historical panel. It explains where the bunker once stood, shows a basic diagram, describes what happened there. No heroic language, no sensationalism, just history, matter of fact, exactly as it should be. If you visit today, you'll notice something striking. People rarely stay very long. They read the sign, look around, take a photograph, then quietly leave. Perhaps that's because there isn't much to see. Or perhaps it's because the weight of the place isn't visible. It's invisible, buried beneath layers of concrete and memory. The real bunker no longer exists as people imagine it. Only fragments remain underground. Most of it was destroyed decades ago. The rest, sealed forever. Ironically, the place once considered the center of Nazi power has become one of the least dramatic historical sites in Berlin. Nearby, you'll find bustling cafes, office buildings, cyclists waiting at traffic lights. Life continues exactly as it should. The city rebuilt itself, not by pretending history never happened, but by refusing to let one man define it forever. History often gives famous places enormous endings. Ancient castles become museums. Battlefields become national parks. Palaces become monuments. Hitler's bunker became a parking lot. There's something strangely fitting about that. The regime that spent years building colossal architecture to symbolize a 1,000-year Reich lasted barely 12 years. Its final headquarters survived even less. Sometimes, history delivers its own quiet form of irony. If you stand there today, it's difficult to imagine what happened beneath your feet. The narrow corridors, the endless hum of generators, the military conferences, the whispered conversations, the final wedding, the gunshot, the hurried burning of bodies beneath falling artillery shells. Nothing on the surface hints at any of it. The city has moved on. Nature has moved on. Time has moved on. Only history remembers. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. The bunker wasn't the beginning of Hitler's story. It was simply the place where it ended. The real story had unfolded over years. Through political choices, military decisions, propaganda, fear, violence, and the actions of millions of ordinary people swept into extraordinary events. The bunker was merely the final room, where all of those consequences finally caught up with him. Because no matter how thick the concrete walls, no matter how deep the underground shelter, no matter how many soldiers stood outside, history has a way of reaching everyone in the end.